public life. The role of the committee is to advise the Prime Minister and the government of the day on the processes and procedures underpinning the maintenance of high standards in public life. We're not a regulator and we don't investigate complaints. We are an advisory body, and we're delighted to have with us this morning Lord Pickles, the chairman of the Advisory Committee on Business Appointments. For the 25th anniversary of the committee, 2 years ago, we commissioned academic work on the tapestry of standards bodies that have grown up over the last few decades. And the purpose of our current inquiry is to identify areas where there may be gaps or overlaps, recommendations for improvement, and also to highlight areas of best practice on standards regulation. It's important to say that in the course of this live evidence on YouTube, we will not be touching on individual cases, and we are not also touching on any individual cases that are in front of the courts. We have on the committee's side Dr. Jane Martin, an independent member, Dame Shirley Pearce, an independent member, and Manisha Shah, independent member, and Dame Margaret Beckett, who is one of our political members on behalf of the Labour Party. Lord Pickles, thank you very much indeed for being with us this morning. In your written submission, you wrote that it must be made clear to the public and the individuals concerned exactly how the government holds individuals to account in respect of their responsibility to act with honesty and integrity. Could you comment on how successfully you think, under the current arrangements, ministers and civil servants are held to account on issues of ethics and propriety? And is the current regulatory standard in government fit for purpose?
Well, I do think, well, first of all, because I thank you very much for the opportunity to be able to contribute to this inquiry. I think it's timely because I think it's time to re-establish the 7 principles. I think I would urge against finding an 8th principle. I think the 7 principles are well established. And I think there is sometimes a problem in British public life so far as ethics are concerned, is that we do have a tendency to react to crisis. And most of the major change are brought in at enormous haste, which we have occasionally repented at our leisure. The second thing is that we actually become obsessed with process, procedure. And I think we would be better looking at the 7 principles and seeking by process of audit to ensure that each of the varying landscapes that makes up are the way in which we bring ministers, civil servants and ex-ministers and ex-civil servants into account. I think it will make enormous sense to do that. I have watched some of the previous evidence, and I have to say, having listened to it, I'm not entirely convinced of the idea of one ring to unite them all would be a satisfactory way of moving forward. I think that it would be unwieldy and possibly even slightly sinister. But I do think it's important that the government makes it clear what it expects. I mean, the present system is one that encourages movement between the civil service and the private sector, local government, and voluntary organisations. And actually, I think that's changed. I've been involved in public life for I suppose, quite close to 40 odd years. And the nature of the civil service has dramatically changed. I mean, most people entered the service after university or after school and were almost certainly staying it for the whole of their lives. It's now much more common, even on the top echelons, to move in and out. And I think that's probably to the benefit of the civil service.
It's very interesting that can I pick up 2 things that you said? The first is that you're not attracted to any 8th principle. A number of other jurisdictions have included a respect principle, for instance, because of concerns about the way in which people have behaved towards each other, bullying and harassment, etc. But I take it that you don't feel that that would be a positive move.
I think that's probably including leadership. And I think there is this is my slight worry, and I'm entirely serious about this. It's established. People understand the 7 principles. What would be dreadful is if in trying to enforce the 7 principles, you including an additional one, and you can imagine the kind of the tabloid headlines is the committee becomes the woke committee, the committee goes for the latest fashion. And actually, if an organization has bullying and intimidation within it that is unchecked, that is a fundamental and systemic failure of leadership.
That's very helpful and clear. The other point that you said is you're not attracted to a single kind of overarching regulator, and a number of our other witnesses have said the same, although some have been attracted to the idea. The counter argument, I'm neutral on the issue, is that we currently have a very, very complex system, lots of different regulators with different powers, different arrangements specific, and that this can be complicated to understand, and it's arguable as to whether that really reinforces public trust. What's your view on that?
Well, I think if you kind of imagine what kind of organization would be like and what kind of person would lead it, and I don't know how familiar you are with the television program Games of Thrones. I mean, the kind of person that would run it will possibly be the High Sparrow, so excellently played by Mr. Jonathan Pryce. I think that kind of or sort of moral standpoint, moral sort of overbearing, I think will be just dreadful and not, I think, fitting with the British Constitution. I also think that the nature of the checks and balances do vary. What, say, will be necessary to a continuing member of the House of Commons is, I think, entirely different for an ex-civil servant. I mean, you could really say that the way in which ACABA's developed, the ministerial aspects were kind of tagged on to an existing arrangement for the civil service, and that we've kind of rumbled along for the last few decades using that analogy, which has worked, but occasionally has not worked. So I come back to the point that was made, and I think this is the point that I really want to hammer home, is that stop being obsessed with process and structure and become more concerned about the reality of how the 7 principles should apply. And if I were to sort of hammer it home louder, of all the 7 principles, which one has failed the most? I would suspect it's leadership.
That's a point which I think was also brought out to a significant extent by Bernard Jenkin when he gave evidence to us that actually, ultimately, this is a question of the behaviour of individuals, at least as much as bureaucratic processes. But in that context, how can we be confident that if we don't have those processes, that we can encourage and bring out that personal commitment to doing the right thing, where sometimes that seems to fall short?
It has to start at the top. The ex-ministers, just in my field, ex-ministers, ex-top civil servants, they have to show real leadership, and they have to show a significant discretion. Bernard's evidence, I thought, was very interesting because, when he was talking about lobbying, he said the thing that he was worried about, which was ministers looking towards their retirement, doing favours for companies before, in open anticipation that they would get a job afterwards. And of course, that's exactly what ACABA is there to look at, and it's precisely the level of contact between an ex-minister or an ex-civil servant and a firm going into that we spend an enormous amount of time, much to the irritation of the applicants, going into.
I'm going to hand over at this point to Dr. Jane Martin, who wants to talk specifically more around ACABA. Thank you.
Okay.
Good morning, Lord Pickles. Yes,
Good
indeed.
morning.
Good morning. Yes, indeed. I would like to, hear your view, obviously, as Chair of ACABA, about the effectiveness of ACABA and the business appointment rules. And you have very much set the tone, I'm sure, for your answers to these questions in your opening remarks. But let me give you the opportunity to expand on those, if you would. So let me start with this whole notion of when a business appointment is appropriate or inappropriate. You've already made the point that there is much more movement between public and private sectors today. It's common and is accepted. So we'd really like to hear your view about what is the purpose of the business appointment rules and when is it appropriate or inappropriate in your view?
Okay, can we just sort of would you mind if I just pull back and for like a minute just explained what I've been trying to do with ACABA?
Sure.
I wanted to apply, and I think we do apply a proportionate system, and we had a very big meeting in July in which we set out some clear criteria. So it starts off, if you're not being paid for something, if you're doing something voluntary, then we won't give you the degree of scrutiny that we might otherwise have done. If you're going back to a profession that you had before, then we'll put down some standard, and we won't give an enormous amount of attention to it unless there are certain circumstances. If you are involved, if you are going into a field in which you had no ministerial responsibility, we'll give a greater degree of scrutiny. But the greatest degree of scrutiny that we give is if you had a responsibility for that particular aspect before you step down, and we will put an enormous amount of effort into that. And it was with that aim that we will concentrate on these more difficult cases. Now, we need to remember that the ACABA rules are government rules. They're not put together by ACABA, and they are on the basic premise of those rules is that it is permissible, almost encouraged for civil servants and for senior ministers to find employment outside government. Our role is to look very closely at the risk to government reputation, and we firm in on the level of contact between the applicant and the new company that they're seeking to be employed by, and that is very difficult. We have really two weapons in our armory, which is one is either delay and the other is laying down conditions.
Sure. Thank you very much for that. So, are you satisfied then, on the basis of what you're seeking to do, that ACABA is ensuring compliance with business appointments rules, or do you have areas of concern? Do you feel that it's generally understood? I mean, you've explained quite clearly to us, the criteria, if I can put it that way. But is that, do you feel that is the way to make ACABA effective, and is that understood by ministers and the public?
Well, we've been rolling a number of reforms out. We've increased the amount of transparency in our letters. That is to say, we give much more information about why a decision was made. The applicant has a higher duty to explain why they fall within the exceptions to the rule. You may have noticed that from about October onwards. From the beginning of this year, we started to report people who we previously regarded as a retrospective application. We now regard that as a breach of the rules. And we will be recording each person that has failed to observe the rules in our annual report. But ultimately, that's a matter for government. These are not our rules. These are the government's rules. And the government could change the rules in the bat of an eye if they wanted to.
Sure. But just to push you slightly, I completely understand the situation you're describing. But you are in the, if I could say, the hot seat. You're the one who, as chair of this organisation, is trying to make sure that you get compliance. Are you currently satisfied? Just to sort of put that direct question, and also sort of aligned to that. I mean, do you have any concerns that significant cases, are remaining under the radar at the moment?
Just put it in context. A couple of years ago, about 32,000 civil servants left government. We will look at about 39 of them. We're only dealing with the top level of civil servants. In terms of underreporting, I think now, in the age of the web, in the age of mobile phones, that's almost impossible to do, particularly if for members of either the Lords or the Commons, it's difficult to do because there are registers of interest and people cross-check them. And the failure to record for the, say, in the House of Commons interest register is far more serious than not reporting to ACABA. We'll probably get maybe 15 to 20 a year. And that basically is the befuddled and the muddled and the confused that they haven't kind of put in, and it's just a failure to do so. If we took 2019, 2020 together, we're roughly dealing with about 300 breaches, of which only 8 you could say was an attempt to deceive. So by and large, it's like most things in the British Constitution, it works reasonably well. But you do need to be very vigilant. But we're not a watchdog. We're not a regulator. The only thing that we are concerned with is the risk to government, risk to reputation, risk for the misuse of information, government information, for personal gain. We don't, for example, look at the number of jobs that a person may be taking. We don't look at the level of the income. That's for them to justify. And if you'll forgive me for just slightly abusing this question, the one thing that I found deeply irritating about the rules, it has the word agreed within them, and our agreement does not relate to the nature of the job or whether or not the person should take it. It's an agreement that it falls within the rules. And I certainly hope we can remove that at some stage, because there has been a habit of employers and applicants of hiding behind, going through the process to give them some kind of legitimacy, which we're not seeking to grant.
And just finally from me, you have absolutely preempted my final question, but let me just follow it up. You have, as you just said again, ACABA is not a regulator nor a watchdog. Should it be, or are you content? I mean, you are stating, as it were, the fact, the status, but would you like to see that changed?
Well, again, if you forgive me, I hope I'm not being rude. It's the wrong question. The question is, what is the consequences of breaching the rules? And if we were to say, let's take two examples. Let's take, say, an honest, decent former cabinet secretary who takes a voluntary lectureship at a university and fails to declare. If we compare that with, say, someone like Alan Bastard, who joins Spectre and works with Blofeld to murder the firstborn of all families in the world. So far as ACABA is concerned, well, so far as the government is concerned, the penalty is exactly the same. Nothing happens. I hope that that law enforcement will take care of Alan Bastard in other ways, but the government needs to be clear: what are the consequences of breaching the rules?
Yes.
Now, perhaps I'm being entirely unfair because of the people that come before us are people of high reputation, and they don't enjoy appearing in the Daily Mail or the Daily Mirror when their breaches do occur. And even in my time, I've seen people lose jobs or lose their employment opportunities because of the effect it's had on their reputation. But I do think the government needs to be clear, and it will have to, I think, in future clearly say why it's not taking any disciplinary action against people who breach the rules.
Thank you very much. I think that's all from me. I think Dame Shirley's next, probably want to follow up on that precise point. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hello, Lord Pickles. Thank you very much. One of the powers that you do have, and which you've talked about using more explicitly, is that of transparency and being open and using information in the public domain to motivate behaviour. I just wondered if you could talk through the pros and cons of that as a power, and whether there are any disadvantages of that approach.
Well, to be honest, I've always believed in transparency. I mean, when I was a minister, I opened up council meetings to social media and to be able to video record, and I just think it's the most sensible way of doing it. I think if you're there trying to oversee that element of probity, it makes sense for the public to have a better understanding as to why you've arrived at the decisions. I mean, most of the stories that you see in the newspapers, they've actually come from our releases. It's very rarely original journalism. I say that without any disrespect to journalists, but we place them out in the public domain, and it's been quite noticeable that I think the quality and the understanding as to why we've arrived at a particular decision. So I don't really see a downside to this, because it offers a greater public understanding. It doesn't mean to say the public are going to approve of people taking these jobs. It doesn't mean to say that, but at least their opposition is one based on an understanding of the rules and why the committee has arrived at a particular view.
I can well see that it helps public understanding. I'm sure that's right, and transparency is terribly important. Is it an effective mechanism for changing behaviour or increasing compliance with the rules if people really just happy to brazen it out, for example?
Well, of course, if it's just the person, if it's just the applicant, then I can understand the point. But the fact that we publish what the departments say, I think it now means, again, without any disrespect, but it does mean that people have to stand by what they say, that you can't tick a box, that the government department has to give a very careful thought in terms of whether there's an objection or whether there isn't an objection. We can perhaps talk about what happens if there is an objection in a few moments. The other thing that we have actually noticed is that since sort of the autumn, since about October, when we've been putting these into the public domain, that we've found a combination of government departments and newspapers and members of the public have written in and say that such and such a person isn't abiding by the rules, and we followed that up, and again we've put the correspondence online, and I think you'd have to be extraordinarily, overwhelmingly brazen not to be able to turn you back to the kind of scrutiny that newspapers and the press gave. if you're a member of Parliament, is extremely damaging. If you're a member of the House of Lords, it's extremely damaging. If you've gone into private life, it's probably less so. But it does, as I said earlier, it does have a knock-on effect about your employability, because people do not want to employ somebody who has essentially failed an ethics test.
Okay, that's helpful. So you're using the transparency as powerful a tool as you possibly can. Let's just go back to your point about if there is an objection. What are the sanctions, and are they appropriate for if there is an objection?
As the Prime Minister, I refer to my earlier answer. There are no sanctions, none.
So
none whatsoever, and I'm not aware in the past sort of 30 years of a single sanction being imposed. Now, we are we're in negotiations, and I think we're at a position where we will be consulted with regard to honours. It will make sense for us to be consulted with regard to going into the House of Lords. It would make sense for us to be consulted about future government appointments for individuals who have failed. But I don't see that any greater than saying doing the standard checks with the tax office to make sure the person's tax is up to date. And I wouldn't in any way wish to fetter the Prime Minister's ability to make awards, to appoint people to positions. But I do feel that the Prime Minister should at least have the availability of the information about past conduct in front of them before they make their decisions. But I firmly believe it's not for ACABA to justify the lack of sanctions. It's for the government. The government has to explain why it's acceptable to break the rules.
So we, CSPL, are doing this review of standard matters to evidence session is an important part. So we are in a position of making suggestions and recommendations. What is your advice to us about what we should be saying about the fact there are no sanctions?
I think it will be sensible for the government to determine what sanctions are to be. And if you were looking for something that I think the system is not good at, I've grown increasingly concerned about the number of lobby organisations, professional lobbyists, that ex-ministers and more particular ex-civil servants are joining. Now, of course, we do lay down some very stringent guidance about their inability to lobby. We do put down some time. But I think there's a reasonable question is this. If a person is going into a lobby group and they're not allowed to lobby, what are they doing? I mean, I can think of a number of my ex-colleagues who'd be very good at offering advice on feng shui. I can see a number of colleagues who'd be very good at putting together, say, a darts lead within an organisation. But if they're not doing it, and given what we're seeing is happening in America and Australia, I think we need to address whether it's appropriate to join a lobbying company or not within a 2-year period.
That's really helpful, and it leads on very nicely to the questions my colleague Manisha Shah I'd like to ask about lobbying. Lord Pickles, thank you very much.
Okay.
Good morning, Lord Pickles.
Hello there.
Hello. So just carrying on your thoughts about lobbying, do you think that the lobbying ban itself is, we know there's no statutory ban on lobbying government after office. Do you think that that is sufficient?
Again, just to take a run at this, well, I explained I've been in the process of evolution in terms of changing things. One of the next things that we are going to be looking at is the nature of lobbying, and in particular, people who go on to other forms of public life, say local government or on the health service. And I think on some circumstances, if it's in the open, if it's properly recorded, that's fine. What isn't permissible is for people to use their address book to see people at, if you like, a London club or at the local Labour club. That's not permissible. Providing it's in the open. I mean, again, if you were looking for further suggestions, I mean, given that we spend an enormous amount of time looking at the level of contact, now, particularly with ministers, there's a register of appointments. It would make a lot of sense if there was more information on those as to the nature of the discussion, which I think will be very helpful. But again, I would kind of warn you. I really think we shouldn't be obsessed by process or structure. We should look at the particulars. And conventions, I think, sometimes are as strong as putting things into statute.
I was going to ask you about your comment about being obsessed by processes when you talked about just recording the appointment would then make it fine. No,
that's not what I'm said. That's not close to what I said. It wouldn't make it fine. It would give Akaba and those outside a better understanding as to the nature of the relationship. It's from that I was doing. I'm not saying it will be fine.
Thank you. I suppose it brings to mind the question of how significant really is the problem of former ministers and civil servants, senior civil servants lobbying their former colleagues. What is your view? How significant is it?
Those that follow the Akaba rules, my view is they almost certainly keep to them because the consequences in terms of their reputation is quite serious. And as I said, of the 300 odd cases in the last 2-3 years, we've only had 8 where we've been concerned. And in those cases, we would almost certainly wish to publicly write to them and publicly get a response. But again, it's a matter for government whether or not they decide. I mean, a number of things have happened to ensure that it's not as it used to be, where ex-civil servants can just wander into their old departments and seek information.
Thank you. Lord Pickles, I have a couple of questions on another aspect, which is about enforcement of the rules in government departments. So in your view, how big are the risks of business appointments at levels that are below a covert price?
You're likely to be concerned about this. I'm slightly less worried than I was a little while ago, and I'll come on to that in a second. But the overwhelming majority of business appointments take below Akaba level. We never see them. So we've only got anecdotal evidence as to what's gone on. Some departments have a very well-established structure of dealing with things. And I will point to the Ministry of Defence. They're very organised in where they go out. Other places, which forgive me, I won't name, are not organised. They are verging on the slapdash, and in some cases quite negligent. And there's a complete lack of application. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, we had this case where a former minister was applying for permission to work for a company quite properly, and nothing wrong with that. And it turned out that it had been set up by his or her private secretary who'd left the government and had not sought permission. People were aware that they were doing it, and we got some less than satisfactory response to say, well, they would have got through it. What were we worrying about? Now, actually, I regard that as being quite serious. And if, say, I was a predatory company, I won't be concerned about the top civil servants or the MPs. Where I'd be wanting to concentrate would be below AQUA level. Now, I said that I was not as concerned. I expressed concern about this when I first started the office, and obviously because of COVID and various other things, I've not really been able to bear down with the with the ministers and senior civil servants. Senior civil servants are aware of this, and so are ministers. We've agreed a programme of activity which we will bring a degree of structure and process and familiarity with the rules into individual departments, and we'll roll that out. And I'm kind of hoping by the turn of the year we'll have something in place that is very robust, taking on best practice. It's not a threatening thing we're doing. It's a way of kind of heading off a problem that might occur. But it is a real problem with the current system. But I'm very pleased that the government understands this problem. The government wants to do something about it, and ACABA is going to cooperate in that process.
Thank you very much, Lord Pickles. That's all of my questions. I'm going to hand over to Dame Margaret.
Thank you very much. Lord Pickles, you have been, if I may say so, absolutely crystal clear about the fact that that your committee has no weapons at its disposal, that there are no sanctions of any kind. And I think it's right and admirable to get that so clearly on the record. But could I just press you on a couple of aspects of that briefly, if you like? You've said over and over again, that's not a matter for this committee, your committee, that's a matter for the government. If you were the Prime Minister, would you think that there should be sanctions? And what sort of sanctions might you consider? Fines or something else?
Well, I think I think it's important not trying to slay a paper tiger, because the majority of the breaches that I deal with are people who have just been forgetful and or have misunderstood the rules. It's only in a very limited number of hard cases that we have. I think that what should be available at the minimum is an ability for people to look about what happens next, i.e. what happens with regard to honours, what happens with regard to the House of Lords, what happens with regard to public appointments. And again, I would emphasise, I'm not seeking in any way to fetter the Prime Minister. But I do believe in openness, and if a Prime Minister decides against people's past behaviour to promote them, to reward them in some ways, that's a matter for him or her, and it's a matter for him or her to justify that decision. There's nothing wrong with a bit of transparency.
That is also admirably clear, and it deals with all the examples I had in mind. So thank you very much. I believe, is it back to you, Jonathan?
I think it's coming back to me. Could I ask as we sort of move towards the close, can I ask a very specific question? There's been some controversy about Prime Ministers lobbying and so on. Do you feel that the rules in respect of Prime Ministers should be the same as any other minister, or does their particular influence and power mean that there need to be tighter rules for former Prime Ministers? So that's the first question I just wanted to put as we move towards closure.
Well, Prime Ministers are dealt with exactly the same way as other senior ministers as far as ACABA is concerned. I mean, I've read the newspapers, and the individual concern is not of ACABA's concern, is a private individual, and is moved on. Do I think there should be a review of lobbying? Yes, I think there should be a review of lobbying, and this is something that maybe they need to take into consideration. Prime Ministers are, and ex-Prime Ministers are, powerful people, but it's important that the system is resistant to powerful people. And while I know nothing of the circumstances of the case other than what I've read, it does seem that a powerful person was resisted. Not that I'm suggesting for 1 second that there was anything wrong or undone in the process, but again, I just think it's important. These things should be transparent and in the open.
Thank you. And finally, you've been in public life, as you said, for 40 years. You've had experience in local government, in national government, in Parliament. Our committee sometimes gets, told, well, the situation is getting much worse, standards are, falling. Do you have a view on that? Is it your perception that there is a trend in terms of standards, or do you think, it's kind of it's always been like this? There will always be sort of skirmishes. But what's your perspective looking back over a long and distinguished career in public service?
I'm not that old, but I don't think the Lloyd George administration would have survived your scrutiny whatsoever. No, I mean, I think it's always there. I think that we are more aware of it because there is greater scrutiny than there ever was. I think the Freedom of Information Act has played a very important part in bringing things together. No, I don't think we should. I don't think we should feel terribly worried or upset or feeling that things have gone terribly wrong. But what we should do, what I urge you to do, is to look very carefully at those 7 principles and look at ways in which we can effectively audit the people looking at ethics to make sure that we are applying and manage them. I mean, when I was a minister, I used to have the 7 principles in my top drawer, and I would occasionally look at them. And I would particularly look at them before I considered any planning application, just to remind us where we are. And I think, leadership is terribly important, and we shouldn't look for if, say, we went to a statutory basis, that would make any real difference. I mean, I listened to Tony Wright's evidence. It's no kind of reflection on his advancing years, but I kept thinking about King Lear. So far as a statutory, that we were going to do such things with a statutory system. We know not what they're going to be, but they will be the wonders of the world. A statutory system has no advantage if there are no penalties, if there are no consequences. And I think it's always bear down on the issues, always look at the issues. And I think if you do that, as I'm sure you will, that's a proper way to address it, because people can resist. They can resist structures and they can restrict organisation, but they can't in any way ignore the issue and the truth.
Well, Pickles, thank you very much indeed for helping us